Hi, students. We are now looking at Chapter 5, Toward Transformative Justice, my favorite chapter in the textbook. And this is the last chapter before we move on to the section, Part 2, which is Issues in Social Justice. So what we have done is looked at all of these different models of justice and how they are implemented in society, how they affect an individual versus a macro level of society, such as institutions. And this is the final one. Before the chapter even begins to talk about transformative justice, we have information about restorative justice, because transformative and restorative justice are actually sometimes interchangeable in terms of how people use them and refer to them. The authors want to make sure we understand the differences. For restorative justice, the big question they ask here at the beginning is, restore to what? If a system that is in place is already broken, how does restoring someone to the broken system help that individual and help overall society? So a quote that is used later on page 89 that refers to this is, restore offenders to the marginalized, enraged, disempowered condition most were in before the offense. So they are asking the question, how is that justice? Okay. Restorative justice is supposed to be providing an alternative to a criminal justice system. However, it does not address structural issues. To demonstrate how devastating that is for a group, say a state or a country or a colony, the authors give two examples in the textbook: Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria. And they do this right at the beginning of the chapter, before you even get into theories and theorists that have been talking about this. So they use Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico as an example of restoration to repression versus transformation to justice. And there's a trajectory of recovery that they talk about on page 88, I believe. 4 steps: enclosure, exclusion, encroachment, and entrenchment. These are all included in the PDF lecture that supplements this lecture video. So restoration after hurricanes actually follows very much on an individual level. And they talk about at the bottom of 88 that you have a replacement of lost goods and housing by the insurance companies, by government assistance, or other individual and groups that are helping out. However, you are not having the systems that are in place questioned. And this is particularly important when you're thinking about the Puerto Rico example. And in your PDF lecture, I have included a URL link that will talk about this. And I find it fascinating that our authors themselves highlight how Loretta Capehart, one of the authors, is living in Puerto Rico at the time, and talks about how the experiences that they are facing after this hurricane are not what are being implied via media and news outlets. And that happens in the middle of page 88. And so they talk a little bit of the privatization of social responsibilities and how a place like Puerto Rico, which is often, it's considered a modern day colony, they have no rights in terms of who's elected to president or different laws that are passed. They have no vote. And so this results in them having to live under a structure that is unequal or unjust. And they have some issues surrounding being a colonized island as well. And that's all discussed on the bottom of 88 to the top of 89 and in the URL that I have included. So you have a place that is already struggling because of poverty, because of debt, because of all of these historical things that have compounded as we get into contemporary present time, and then you have a natural disaster. And what happens? How do you restore justice? How do you help people? Okay. So after that section, we have a pretty good chunk of this chapter that is talking about actually the critiques of restorative justice. So there are a whole bunch of people that say restorative justice is not a good compromise for our criminal justice system, and instead it's just placing a band-aid on a larger issue. We need something different. And you might notice that band-aid imagery coming up a few places in this chapter. They repeat it. The critiques of it include Ruth Morris, and this time in your PDF lecture notes, I did include page numbers listed underneath each heading. So when you're taking notes for what you found was important in that section, you have a direction for where you can look. And Ruth Morris is actually someone who is considered like one of the first to popularize the term transformative justice. So this individual is already critiquing the previous solution to inequities, which is restorative justice. So Ruth Morris is listed. Feminist critiques are listed. Sociological oriented critiques, specifically looking at alternative dispute resolution. Postmodern critiques of restorative justice. Needs-based critiques of restorative justice. And I did include a slide in your PDF lecture about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because I know a lot of students are familiar with this. It has been taught perhaps in the high school course or in another class. And one of the things with relying on just a needs-based idea for justice is the fact that how do we define that term needs? Okay. In Maslow's hierarchy, it seems pretty self-explanatory. There's physiological needs, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and eventually you get to the point of self-actualization. So physiological needs includes food, shelter. However, do we equate all foods and shelters as being equal or equitable? For instance, if you are someone that has a means of income, when you're hungry, you can choose to go out to a fancy restaurant. I'm going to have steak today, and I'm going to my fancy restaurant. I'm going to order it. I've worked hard for this. Maybe take my family or a friend. If you are an individual who does not have the capabilities to go out and choose food freely, what are you left with? It could be a food bank. It could be a place that is giving away free meals for that evening. And are those needs being equitably matched? Sure, the individual is getting food, but is the food of the same category or degree as those that can afford something better? Would that person who has the financial means to go someplace else ever choose, oh, I'm going to go visit the local food shelter and sit with people and have a meal there? That is a good question to ask. And if I'm thinking of from my own personal life experience to share with you, when we were growing up, we had a lot of issues with being able to pay for food. And so we had to rely on charitable donations from either our church or grocery stores. And often what these donations consisted of, it could be expired food cans, it could be food cans that had labels removed or dents in them. What had to happen before we could even eat the food is my father used to taste everything, because we never knew if what we were getting was actually still good to eat, and second, was actually human food. Because sometimes some of the mystery cans, which is what we called them, mystery can meals, were in fact cat food or dog food. And so my dad would be the first one to try it before the rest of us would be allowed to eat something. So were my family's needs being met to the same degree? That is the question. The final critique is a paradox of restorative justice. I found this section, and this is on page 93, extremely fascinating. The whole second half of that big paragraph. I'll read a little bit of the quote. Empowering the victim does not include challenging social conditions and injustices, but indirect victimhood itself and how to deal with it. That restorative justice attempts to convince the offender of their individual responsibilities to accept it, which is a predicate for further restoration and reintegration, which is precisely what the traditional criminal justice system attempts to do. That restorative justice programs, with their emphasis on the individual, are hard-pressed in dealing also with the realities of certain communities with complex forms of gang violence and other social problems. And hence, restoring communities is hardly a pursued goal. So this idea of, well, if I help the individual, they're going to go back out and fix their communities. But that's not necessarily how it works. And the communities themselves are dealing with a lot of issues that complicate why individuals might go down a certain path than another. So that section is really, really fascinating. As you continue in the textbook, there's a little discussion about some transformation theorists and towards transformative justice. They start with Howard Zerr and Kay Harris. They go on to describe conflict transformation, and they end with the individual I talked about earlier, Ruth Morris, on page 97. And this is where we finally hit the definition of transformation. Transformative is used in connection with justice. It is often related to how individuals and communities undergo change through a healing process. The latter half of this chapter is about holistic models and about considerations for maybe a restorative transformative justice, or sometimes called transformative restorative justice. Can we merge these two ideas together to create something that will actually produce equitable change in our society? And you have to remember, with this chapter and with all of these early chapters in this book, they are talking about complex relationships between micro and macro levels of social change. So there are a few styles that are analyzed specifically by an individual named Donald Black. And they are 4 responses to harm. And there's a great table in the book that shows the responses to harm on page 100. And there's also a definition, and I believe it's used in Is Everyone Really Equal? Stratification on the bottom of page 100 that you should try to understand. And they continue, the authors, to talk about responses to how structure plays a role in social justice. So, for example, one way they show stratification and how not all people are treated equal in society, they give a drug use example. And so when the poor get in trouble from using drugs, maybe dealing drugs, selling drugs, something to do with drug use, they are more likely to be sentenced to prison terms rather than a type of treatment program. For instance, if you are more of a middle class or wealthier individual, because that middle class or wealthier individual is already viewed as someone that is worthy of some kind of rehabilitation, that maybe they were pressured into using drugs and got addicted, but they are overall a good member of society, and we need to invest in their rehabilitation. A poorer individual or someone with maybe a criminal past is viewed as already a pariah to society, someone that is perhaps not worth saving. And there's a really good graph here on page 106. I'm holding it up so you can see it. That shows the relationship between structure, community, and human beings in general. I will end with my favorite section, other than the Ruth Morris section, Andrew Wolfford and Transformative Restorative Justice. So his suggestions and theories start on page 109. And he says, let's get rid of the entire concept of social justice, and that justice is actually process oriented and it's changing just like all these other social structures and cultures in our society. And that one big step for reimagining justice is actually redefining some of the terms associated with justice. I've listed them in your PDF lecture notes. So you can, when you get to this chapter on page 109, you can take notes, if you've printed out your lectures, on notions of victim, offender, a facilitator, and community. So there are 4 areas that Wolfford says need to be redefined. And I feel like the best summary of this entire chapter is actually right before the review questions on page 113. And I've circled it myself. It's a good summary. So make sure you check that out. If you have any questions, as usual, reach out to me via email.